All right, everyone, welcome to Credit 3 of US history. Now, Credit 2 was all about the emergence of the United States as an economic power in the world and how that impacted ordinary citizens. And I talked about how while there was this dramatic economic growth that occurs during the second half of the 1800s, that this growth doesn't lead to improvements in ordinary Americans' lives for the most part, and that workers in factories are being expected to work longer hours for less pay, to have less flexibility in the hours that they do work, and these early factories are incredibly dangerous. And as a result, we start to see social unrest. And the birth of the labor movement, and this idea that workers, if they all band together and ask for improvements, they're going to be more likely to get what they want versus an individual worker who didn't really have much power. And I also talked about how these problems of the early industrial era that these produce in terms of poverty, dangerous working conditions, um, unsafe food, that all of these things that come out of the early industrial era, that this leads to the progressive era, to this shift in the way that people view the role of the American government, right? So now we're moving on to Credit 3, and Credit 3 is all about the emergence of the United States as an imperial power in the world, kind of completing our transformation into the dominant superpower in world affairs. Now, a lot of times what you'll hear is people say that this happens around 1900, and they use the Spanish-American War as an example of the United States becoming an imperial power in the early 1900s. But there's an argument to be made that the United States really becomes an imperial power as soon as it becomes a country, because as soon as we declare our independence, we start taking land from Native American tribal nations and start pushing westward, expanding our territory, right? And if the definition of imperialism is just a country that invades other territories and expands its territory by force, this is absolutely America engaging in imperialism, right? So we expand into the Northwest territories of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, as part of the peace agreement that ends the American Revolution with Britain. So, in other words, our first action as a new emerging country is to take over all of this territory that is still inhabited by Native Americans. And I talked about the 7 Years' War in Credit 1 and um, how this was really driven, before we even declare independence, by this imperialistic impulse on behalf of the American colonists. George Washington wanting that land in the Ohio River Valley and just putting together an army and trying to take it by force, even without the approval of the British king. That he just kind of takes this upon himself and sparks off this massive world war. So America is kind of an empire from the start. And by 1803, we acquire the Louisiana Territory. We double the size of the United States, and we acquire this land from France, who is hopelessly in debt, and they need to unload all of this territory in North America. So they sell it to us for about 42 cents a square mile. But again, this land is still occupied by Native Americans, and the westward movement and settlement of that by these European settlers, by these American settlers, is really pretty slow going. But what happens is during the 30 years after the Civil War, so from about 1865 to 1895, more land comes into cultivation, means being actively settled by American colonists or American settlers, than had come into cultivation in the previous 2.5 centuries. So in 30 years, more land is cultivated than in 250 years of American history. So why is this the case? The first reason is that before this, we'd been a country that had slavery. Half of the country was what was known as free states, states that had already outlawed slavery, so the states in the north, and then half of the country, the states in the south, were slave states that continued to engage in the practice of slavery, right? And I talked about one of the reasons that the Civil War happens is that every time we expand into a territory further west, this sparked off debates in Congress over whether slavery was going to be allowed in those new territories. And there was bitter fighting over the balance of power between slave states and free states, and what this meant for the future of the institution of slavery. That if more free states were allowed to come into the United States, that this would give the North the power to outvote the South and eventually eliminate the institution of slavery. And the North feared that if too many slave states came in, that this would give the South too much voting power in Congress to, say, force the North to allow slavery in their territories. And so these bitter debates happened, and this meant that westward expansion was slowed quite a bit because this issue had to be resolved each time a new state wanted to become part of the United States. So after the Civil War, this effectively ends slavery, and this effectively kills this debate in Congress. It doesn't have to happen anymore, which frees the country up to expand westward at an incredibly rapid rate. But also, shortly after the Civil War, the United States ends its policy of treating Native American nations effectively as independent nations. In other words, it becomes a foregone conclusion by most Americans at this point that the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean in North America, what becomes the present day United States, that this belongs to the U.S., and that Native American nations don't have an independent claim to that land. And so we eliminate the treaty system that we had previously had for negotiating with tribes as independent nations in 1871. And then in 1887, basically what we do is we break up all of the land that the tribes are actually living on, that for the most part, most of these Native American tribes held the land communally. This wasn't individual properties the way that we think of, right? You buy a house and that land is yours. That's kind of like the Western conception of ownership of property. But Native Americans really viewed this as like, we hold all of this land communally. This is our territory and we all share it. And so in 1887, the American government basically decides that we are no longer going to allow Native American tribes to do this, to hold a whole swath of territory communally as the tribal land. What they're going to do is instead break up that land into small parcels, the way that we think of individual property ownership. We distribute some of those to Native American families, and the rest we auction off to white purchasers. This allows them kind of the moral license to say we're still allowing the Native Americans to keep their land, but we're forcing them in to adopt Western notions of how land ownership should work. And this allows us to take over large parts of previously Native American controlled land. And all of this was really justified through two ideas. The first being manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was just the belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the American continent, in other words, from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west, that this was both justified, meaning it's okay, and inevitable, meaning it's bound to happen sooner or later. And many Americans held this view in the 1800s. They argued that Western imperialism brought with it improvements to society for the cultures that were dominated or displaced by these policies, that these American settlers built schools and churches. They brought with it the American style of government, and therefore this was benefiting the cultures that we were displacing. And this idea that it was actually beneficial grew out of an idea called social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism was just an attempt to take Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution, the idea of survival of the fittest, that organisms that are better suited to their environment are going to thrive, while organisms that are not very well suited to their environment are going to die off. That they attempted to take these ideas about natural phenomenon and apply them to human civilization. And so, if Native Americans were dominated by white settlers, if they were forced off of their land, that this was seen as proof of Anglo-Saxon superiority, that if you were successful in taking over another culture and taking their land, you were able to do this because your society was superior over theirs. That structural inequalities in society were seen as natural competitions between societal groups. That any kind of discrimination and imperialistic policy was justified because this was natural competition, survival of the fittest. That societies that are best suited to adapt are going to thrive. They're going to gain more land. And the status held in society was seen as an indicator of your value to society. And these two ideas, social Darwinism and manifest destiny, they really combine to justify a series of atrocities during the second half of the 1800s. That this idea that westward expansion is natural, necessary, inevitable, and that it ultimately benefits the societies that are displaced, as well as the belief that the successful domination of another culture is evidence of your own superiority over that culture. That this gives moral license, that this gives justification for all kinds of different stuff. And now you can see here this picture of a man standing next to a big pile of stuff. I don't know if you can tell by the details of it, but that is a pile of buffalo skulls. And it was official U.S. policy, as we're expanding across the areas controlled by the Plains Native American tribes, that the buffalo was a central part of their way of life. And the reasoning was, if we can eliminate the buffalo, if we can eradicate them, we can eradicate their very way of life, which will render them unable to resist our domination of them. This is just one example. Of how manifest destiny and how social Darwinism allowed for increasingly brutal tactics used in our expansion westward. And as we expand westward, and as the United States becomes the economic power that it did during the second half of the 1800s, people start to turn to westward expansion to explain America's economic success. One of the people that does this more than anyone else is a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. He described the frontier as the line between civilization and savagery, and he argued that Western settlers, every time they moved further west, that they had to essentially rebuild society from scratch. They had to build towns and make decisions about how their communities were going to be governed and this sort of stuff, that they had to rebuild society, and this work of rebuilding society over and over and over again. This was the explanation for American exceptionalism, for America's growing role as a economic powerhouse. They argued that this constant expansion west was fueling this, that this was producing a higher caliber of person because they were going through this ordeal of building society over and over again. But there's a problem with this, right? People really kind of buy into this idea. But by 1900, the West had closed. There was nowhere for us to go to rebuild society from scratch again. And so if you've bought into this notion that westward expansion is what has made America exceptional, by 1900, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, they're connected. The United States has successfully expanded across that entire territory. So what do we do now?